In the spring of 1857, Mr. Dangberg went to Placerville over the Sierra in California to sell what he had produced. And when he came back a few days later, he found a man named Lucky Bill Thorrington sitting on his porch. Lucky Bill was holding a shotgun. And he said to Mr. Dangberg, "What are you going to do now, Dutchman? This land is mine." He was jumping his claim and taking it over. And at that time, there is no government here, there is no law enforcement, it's every man for themselves. And so Mr. Dangberg decides, hey, I'm going to walk away to fight another day. And he comes to this location where we are now and starts again. Another cabin, another claim of land. But this time he partnered with some of his buddies who had nearby claims, and they protected each other's property when they were away from them so they wouldn't get jumped again. Mr. Thorrington wasn't very lucky, after all, despite his name. The following year, he was accused of participating in a murder up in Susanville. Probably didn't do it. There's no evidence one way or the other. But his rivals took that opportunity to accuse him of the crime and get rid of him. The gallows were finished before the trial was, and that was the end of Lucky Bill Thorrington.
We actually saw the Genoa Museum where he was hanging out. Was it the Genoa Courthouse? Is that where
Yeah, he had a lot of activities in Genoa.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if that's where they built the gallows or not.
No, the trial and the gallows, Bob Ellison, the Warren Wilson guy, he told me it was over off of the Indian Hills mountain along Clear Creek. There was a ranch there and a barn, and that's where it all happened. The hanging tree that's over in Genoa, that's from the 1890s.
Oh, okay.
That's a completely different episode.
So they were building the gallows before trial was over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was vigilante justice, and hey, let's get rid of the guy. Now here at the home ranch, Mr. Dangberg, one of the first things he did was build a diversion dam in the river so he could turn water onto his land, irrigate it, and actually grow something. That was just the first of many irrigation projects that the Dangbergs are responsible for here in Carson Valley. They're known for their aggressive ditch digging, you might say. And today, a good component of the irrigation system that's still in use, the canals and the ditches and those types of things, many of them were established by the Dangbergs. For 7 years, he's working all by his lonesome. Working very hard. It's said that if the moon was full, he would be out all night long working in the fields. And in 1859, he prospers because the Comstock booms up in Virginia City. All of a sudden, there are thousands of people and work animals that have to eat, and so Mr. Dangberg is down here in the valley along with the other early ranchers, selling what they produced up there and doing quite well. He expands his operation, he acquires more land, he diversifies, and prospers. But he's still single. He did write to his brothers back in Germany. He said, "Come out and join me." But he said to one of them, "Be sure to bring a wife. There are no women here." And that's why we think he was very fortunate in 1864 to meet Margaret Ferris. Margaret, right?
Wow.
Yes. She went by Maggie. Do you go by Maggie?
At one time I did.
Yeah, okay. Maggie Ferris was her name. And they met on the night her family arrived here in the valley. They had just immigrated in a covered wagon across the plains from Galesburg, Illinois. In Galesburg, the Ferrises were quite prominent. Maggie's grandfather was one of that town's founders. His preacher was George Washington Gale, the leader of the congregation, and he's the namesake of Galesburg. Here in Carson Valley, the Ferrises are staying at the home of one of their cousins, Chauncey Noteware, who was Nevada's first Secretary of State. And he invites the neighbors to meet his respectable cousins, the Ferrises. The couple is introduced. They marry the next year when Mr. Dangberg is 35 years old, and Maggie is almost a spinster at 16.
Oh, boy.
Now, the folks in the paintings right here, these are Maggie's parents. You can see a resemblance with her mother, Martha, and her father, and the other portrait was George Washington Gale Ferris Sr., named by his parents after their friend the preacher. There are pencil writings on the back of both of the frames that tell us the portraits were gifts from the couple's children for their 50th wedding anniversary in 1890. And that was quite the achievement back in the 19th century. They had about 8 children, if I recall correctly. Maggie was their oldest daughter. Their oldest son is in that photograph over there in a Civil War uniform. Their youngest son was George Washington Gale Ferris Jr., named after his father. And you may recognize that name by now. Young George Ferris Jr. was the creator of the original Ferris wheel.
Oh, that's where I saw that yesterday.
The Ferris wheel debuted at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, the Columbian International Exposition, and the Dangbergs did have the money to go back to Chicago to experience the wonders of the fair. And they brought back the souvenirs that we have over there on the 1960 Zenith Hi-Fi. How often do you hear hi-fi these days? Without a B on the end. The original Ferris wheel as seen in that photograph was quite large. Each of the 36 cars was almost the size of this room, with seating for 40 people and a heating stove in each one. And it was quite a success. Now go ahead and walk around the room a little bit.
May I?
Yes, you may. Good timing. The rug you're walking on is a genuine Persian rug made in about 1930. It was made by hand.
Huge original, isn't it?
You'll see more Persian rugs in the other rooms. They're all from the same era, but they've only been in the house since the family purchased them in the 1960s. Around the room you also see a whole bunch of Chinese ceramics. The highlight of our collection is here on the table, the 8 Immortals, figures from Taoist philosophy. The Immortals are also seen on the 2 vases down here, and there's a large vase between the 2 chairs
So
behind
much
you.
of this influence.
Well, the cooks that worked for the family were Chinese men, and we're told that they would give the family gifts to ensure they were being hired back for the next season, or when they came back from visiting their family in China. And we have some smaller pieces that may have been some of those gifts, but the influence, is a good word for it, one of the Dangberg granddaughters developed an interest in Asian art, and so she would purchase these from antique dealers, like the rugs in the 1960s and 70s. We have this little wood carving that actually may have been a gift from one of the cooks, or created by, whatever. That's our catalog number, but right there, very faintly in pencil, it seems to be some Chinese characters, but I'm not sure. And of course, that's a Chinese figurine. This depicts a Chinese man.
That's an unusual.
That is probably the rarest of our ceramics. It's a handmade piece, and I was told that it was designed as a wine jar, and that the characters on the front translate to the name of the wine shop, Precious Memories. But it's a magic wine jar, can you tell? Because the morning after, that translates to horrific nightmares. In contrast with the 1960 Hi-Fi down in this corner, you go ahead and go look. We have a 1906 Victrola. It's the first electrified model of Victrola, so there's no crank on the side. The turntable is powered by electricity, the speakers in the front, and a storage compartment on each side for phonograph albums. The indentations on the rim, you see the little scratch marks? Those are teeth marks left there by the last little boy to grow up in this house in the 1930s. He wanted to see what was going on inside the box, and it was too short to look at. Just a little boy. You never did anything like that, did you? Did Michael?
No, but I remember.
Yes, I did.
Now, we have 750 phonograph records in our collection, starting with Edison's and Edding, the 33 1/3 LPs from the 1970s. Those 750 phonograph records are just one small portion of our very large collection of artifacts, photographs, and documents. We have nearly 40,000 items here, and almost all of them were found here on site. And that originality is something that most historic homes can't claim, and one reason that this is a treasure.
They're savers, weren't they?
You might notice the newspapers there, one recognizing Victory in Europe Day in 1944, if I remember my dates correctly. 1945, excuse me. And the quilt there on the sofa is our newest acquisition, given to us by a supporter who purchased it at an estate sale in the 1980s from one of the Dangberg cousins, and they donated it here to us just recently. The center squares, our best information tells us that the center squares have fabric from the 1870s, so we assume that that's when they were first put together, and the outer squares are pieces from later than that. My guess is that they're early 20th century, and once you know that information, you kind of see a difference in both the style of the fabric and the age of the fabric as well.
Wow, that was a wonderful acquisition, wasn't it?
I was very happy to get it, especially because the Dangbergs didn't leave us any nice quilts like this. The nicest bedspread we have is chenille.
No.
Yeah, boring. We have a jade statue right there.
Yeah, so much Oriental, that's.
It's beautiful.
And then I do want to tell you what happened to this couple. In 1902, the Dangbergs founded the Dangberg Land and Livestock Company. Mr. Dangberg is getting on in years, and so they have to have a way to transfer what they own to the next generation. Now, most agricultural families only own enough to support the oldest son in the next generation, but not the Dangbergs. They owned those 37,000 acres of land, and so they have enough, at least in theory, to support all 5 of their children in the next generation. So they formed that company so that everyone has shares and they can manage it in that way. He died 2 years later in 1904, when he was about 75 years old. Now, about 10 years after her husband's death, Maggie decided, enough of the ranch for me. Her oldest son is raising his family here. I don't know if there were mother-in-law issues or not. But she decides, I'm going to move to the Bay Area. She had 2 sisters living in San Francisco. So she built a home in Berkeley and died there in 1946 at the age of 97. Well, this is one of 2 bedrooms on the main level of the house. There are 3 more bedrooms upstairs, but it's our storage area. So we don't tour the upstairs. And originally this was HF and Maggie's bedroom. Once they were gone, it became a guest bedroom for visitors. But we do tell about HF and Maggie's oldest son and his wife in this room, but their bedroom was upstairs. HF and Maggie Dangberg, this was their first child, Henry Fred Dangberg. And he went by Fred. I like to say he was very proud of his mustache and his part. Don't you think?
Well,
He must have worked hours to get that there, yes. Pretty dapper guy. But in all seriousness, he was very proud of his position as the oldest son of H.F. Dangberg and devoted his life to the company. It was very integral to his own identity. I'm Fred Dangberg of the Dangberg Land and Livestock Company. And he was a risk taker in business. The wheels in his head are always turning, coming up with new ideas on how he can make money or improve the ranch operation or make life in Carson Valley better for his family and by extension everyone else. One of the ideas he had was, well, we need to get the Virginia and Truckee Railroad to expand so that we can have service here in Carson Valley. Not only so that we can have service in the valley, but so that we can have service at the town we're going to create. And in 1905, the Dangbergs founded Minden, one of Nevada's first planned communities. To help that town grow, a railroad will certainly do that, right?
Right.
People back then, they wanted the train to get on it. It makes everything so much easier. And so they gave the V&T free right-of-way across the company land in the northeast part of the valley. And of course, they're going to take advantage of that offer. And they began laying their tracks. Now, the good citizens of Gardnerville said, hey, our town's been here since 1879. We're the established community in the valley, and shouldn't the train come serve us just a little bit further south? Well, guess who owned the land between the 2 towns? The Dangbergs. And they wanted to corner the market of the train, and they demanded a high price for the right-of-way to continue further south, a price that the train wasn't, that the railroad wasn't willing to meet, and as a result, the train stopped in Minden, never went to Gardnerville, and it ran to Minden until 1950, when the entire Virginia and Truckee system shut down. Fred had lots of other ideas. I'm going to tell you the results of those in the next room we go into. But he was, while he was a risk taker in business, he was also a risk taker with his own wallet. A notorious gambler. Today would probably say he had a gambling addiction. And the family lore is that when Fred was a young man, his father sent him to Chicago to sell the herd. And Fred came back with nothing but a fur coat to show for his effort because he had gambled everything else away. And that gambling habit came back to bite him in the fanny later on in his life. That's a good phrase, right? Bite him in the fanny.
I knew exactly what you meant.
But one gamble that we think he took that we think was a safe one was marrying Gertrude Hieronymus, shown in those photos. The back photo is Gertrude in the 1940s, later in her life. And the photo of Gertrude as a young lady is probably taken about when she was 16 in the 1890s, perhaps for her high school graduation. And you'll notice that the dress she's wearing in the photograph is displayed here on the bed.
Oh, boy.
Now Gertrude,
Comely? Is that the word?
Pardon?
Comely? Is that the word?
comely? Oh, I like that one. She's quite comely.
Isn't that the word they used to use?
Yes,
on the
exactly.
olden
I haven't
days?
thought of that for a long time. Thank you. Now, Gertrude was from northeastern California, up near Alturas in Cedarville, and her father was a rancher who had done pretty good. He was able to send her to college, and in 1896, she was one of the first women to graduate from today's University of Nevada, and we have a copy of the class photo there. Gertrude's in the third row with the X marked in front of her. I think she's the prettiest woman in that photo of the six that are there. Probably the second class with women in it. The original of that photograph is 4 times the size, and it's in our collection, and it is the only known photograph of that graduating class in existence. The university didn't even have a copy. She was trained as a teacher, and her first
Never
gig...
knew there wasn't anything else.
Yeah, that's the job opportunity for women at that time. Oh, okay. Well, her first teaching gig was at Alpine County Schools across the border in California, but it didn't last any more than a year because at some point in that time, she met Carson Valley's most eligible bachelor, Fred Dangberg Jr., and they married in San Francisco in 1898, and of course she came in here, and they started a family. Here on the bed we have one of Gertrude's capes made of wool. We have Fred's boxer shorts right over there if you're interested in that. But this is Fred's suit from about 1940 with a Stetson hat. And then behind you on the dressing table we have a photograph of Gertrude with their first child in 1899, her dresser set, and some of her jewelry and makeup. Do you have any questions on anything?
That's my favorite picture.
That's one of my favorite pictures in our collection too. The photos of Gertrude with Dwight are really some of the most wonderful we have, and you'll explain more. You'll understand why later on in the tour. I introduced Fred in the other room. Here he is a little older, got rid of the mustache, can't part with that part.
No.
Now, Fred was the company's secretary-treasurer, kind of the business manager, and he was the oldest, as I said. Almost 3 years ago, Fred was named the Carson Valley Citizen of the Century.
Oh my.
Yes, for all that he had accomplished, like founding Minden and some of the other things I'm going to tell you about here. Now, I'm going to tell you about his family in later rooms because he raised them here. But let me tell you about his brothers and sister. This is John, the next son. John was the company's president and in charge of the sheep. Why was John the president and not the oldest son? Well, for one thing, the presidency was a kind of a status symbol for John's wife. She really relished the fact that her husband was the company's president. And Fred was fine with that because guess who has the power? The guy with the checkbook. And so that's why Fred wanted to be as the secretary-treasurer. John Dangberg married Georgie Beating from Colville, California. It's just down 395, and they had 4 children. One of their sons died young of a childhood disease. A 10-year-old son drowned in one of the company's reservoirs in 1912. And he had 2 daughters as well. Doris married the son of a Nevada Supreme Court justice, but died in 1946 of cancer without having had children. And John's oldest daughter was Grace Dangberg, who did live a long life and was very important in Carson Valley's history. Grace had a master's degree in anthropology. She wrote several books on local history and Washoe Indian folktales. And she was one of the founders of the Douglas County Historical Society. Last but not least, Grace Dangberg became the company's president when her father John died in 1958. She was its last president. And that's a rarity, of course, a female president of a large ranch, yes. Grace never married, no children, and so no grandchildren for John, and his family is completely gone today. Eva, the middle child, was the only daughter, and she held the record for the number of times riding the original Ferris wheel in 1893, 64 times. And the Douglas County Historical Society, I'm told, I haven't seen it, I'm told they have a letter from her uncle, the Ferris wheel inventor, documenting the fact that she rode it more than anyone else. That same year, 1893, she earned a degree in music from Mills College and Seminary in the Bay Area. And in 1899, she married a minister. His name was George Greenfield. Mr. Greenfield was responsible for several churches in central Nevada near Elko. And he's a circuit minister, going from one church to the next every week. And Eva didn't like all that travel her husband's job required, and she said, "Can't we just stay in one place?" So her husband changed denominations so that he could get a better job, and that better job was in Santa Barbara, California. Not a good place, not a bad place to end up, let me put it that way. And they lived out there the rest of their days in Santa Barbara. They were world travelers. They took at least one trip around the globe, and we have a book that her husband co-wrote about that experience. And in this closet here, we found a box, a cardboard box of souvenirs from the Middle East. And one of the items we found in that box was this little box labeled Shells from the Sea of Galilee.
Oh my.
And we guess it was Eva that gathered them herself. Eva's husband died in the 1920s, but she lived on and on and on and on and on. She was 100 when she died in 1973. And I'll let you tell me if her long life can be attributed to the fact that she never had children,
Could be.
or that she didn't have a husband for 5 decades.
How do you spell her name?
Her first name? E-V-A. Today we'd say
I
Eva,
was gonna say, why is it pronounced?
but
that
our
way?
understanding is that it was pronounced Eva. Now, this guy right here is handsome Uncle George, our favorite uncle, and he was the cowboy in the family in charge of the cattle operation. He married Bernice Merrill from Woodfords, California, and they had one son who was George Jr., and then they divorced. But George Sr. here, he did remarry, but his second wife outlived him. He died in 1936 with no children from that marriage. His only grandchild is still living, but she is the last of his line of the family. She has no children of her own, and she's the only person from this branch of the Dangbergs still using the Dangberg name. The youngest, way down here, that's Clarence. Clarence Oliver Dangberg, and he's the one that said, "No ranching for me, you can have it." He sold his shares in the company to his older brothers in the 19-teens and used the money he earned to found one of Nevada's first automobile garages, the COD Garage in Minden. Now the buildings still stand there, and they're vacant right now. They have grand plans for them, but I don't know quite how that's going. But he only ran it for about a decade, and then it was sold to another local family, and they ran it until it closed in 2003. And COD does not stand for cash on delivery, it stands for Clarence Oliver Dangberg. COD is not a really good name for a business, is it? Now, he married twice, he had 5 children, and his branch of the family is still continuing. It's the only branch of this family that will continue into the future, but the Dangberg name is married out of that family now. 2 of his granddaughters are on our nonprofit's board of trustees. Now, one more child from this generation, this little boy right here, his name was Albert, but he died of scarlet fever at the age of 2 in 1870. And just this morning when the school kids come through and we sit them down here and we talk about life in this era for these people when they were little, we have some of their toys here, we have their school books here. Here's Eva as a girl at school. And we talk about Albert, and we talk about how he died and how medicine was usually not medicine, and that getting to a doctor was hard, there were no hospitals, and tried to get them to understand the difference between what life was back in the 19th century in Carson Valley as compared to what it's like today. Do you have any? Oh wait, I have to tell you about these pictures. I don't know why I forget so many things. The COB garage in Minden is on the corner of Esmeralda and 4th Street. And I like to call that intersection the Dangberg intersection because these three buildings are the other three corners. And the Dangbergs either owned them outright or were major partners in their development. This is one of the first buildings in Minden, the Farmers Bank of Carson Valley, and the Dangbergs were one of the founding shareholders. Fred put his head together with the other major ranching families and said, let's start a bank. We can keep our money here working for us instead of sending it to Reno or San Francisco or wherever the major banks were. And it succeeded. A few years later, they built a grander building right across the street. And that was both the Farmers Bank and the Dangberg Company offices. Both of these buildings still stand in downtown Minden. This is one of Fred's ideas that didn't work out so great. This building was built in the 19-teens, and it was the very fancy Minden Inn, a hotel. And Fred thought, hey, we'll build this great hotel. People will come from miles around, we'll rake it in hand over fist. But that was not to be. Times are starting to get tough, and perhaps it was too fancy for this market. Didn't make much of a profit, if any, maybe a loss some years, and the rest of the family said, we're going to unload that. We don't want to be hoteliers, we're ranchers. And so they sold it, and it continued as a hotel until, I believe, the late 70s. Today it's the Douglas County offices. And then you may have already seen this building on Highway 395 in Minden. It's near the Carson Valley Inn, at the corner of Buckeye Road and the highway there. There's a traffic light there. It's the Minden Flour Milling Company. And this is, again, Fred Dangberg getting together with his buddies and saying, we need to have a place locally where we can process our wheat instead of sending it out unprocessed, and we'll cut out the middleman and make more profit. Now, this building still stands, as does the wool warehouse, which is next to it. Same kind of story with the wool warehouse, as well as the butter creamery right behind that building. All the ranchers here are pooling their resources so that they can cut out the middleman and make more profit.
The bricks or the blocks?
These are cardboard
Yes.
with fairy tales on the side. Here is Little Red Riding Hood, the story of Little Red Riding Hood, grandmas, the wolf, and that kind of thing. And at one time, all of these had a letter, you know, they had ends. But this is the outer side, little Bo Peeps, alphabet picture blocks, and these all nest inside there. This game right here, say again?
I just said very nice.
Yeah, we have two sets of those.
Oh.
And this is the better conditioned one. They're both damaged, and one day we might cannibalize one set to restore the other one. We'll see what happens. But this is an interesting card deck here. This set is probably from the 1880s or 1890s, and the game was called Dr. Busby. And there's Dr. Busby.
Oh.
Okay. And there is Cinderella Busby, his daughter. And there's Jack Busby, his son. And there's all kinds of other characters here as well. But when this game was first introduced, it was in the 1840s. This is a later version of it. And Dr. Busby, if I can phrase this correctly, it was the first manufactured game in the United States that was wildly popular. It was the Uno of its day, you might say. Everyone had to have it, and it remained popular for decades.
Interesting.
Now, this is the second bedroom on the main level, and we have a lamb's wool Persian rug on the floor, and the photograph on the wall shows Ruth Dangberg, Ashard, who was the last person to use this room as a bedroom, and she was the second of Fred and Gertrude Dangberg's daughters. So are we oriented on where we're at? We're in the third generation now. Now, Ruth, quite a lovely lady. Here she is as a young woman.
I should say.
She was the first of Fred and Gertrude's 4 daughters to get married. In February of 1930, she married a stockbroker named Charles Stephen Ashard. But what happened a few months before February of 1930? October 1929, the stock market had crashed. Her husband, the stockbroker, is struggling. And by the time she had her baby, Charles Stephen Ashard Jr., shown in those photographs way over there, it had become clear to Ruth that her husband wasn't going to be able to take care of his family. And while there was probably more to it than that, she divorced. And she brought her baby home here to grow up, where her family could take care of him. And he was the last Dangberg child to grow up in this house. You saw his teeth marks on the big troll.
Oh, that's the one.
Growing after she came back home, Ruth never remarried, and she lived in this house for the rest of her life. She died in 1987. The young Charles Stephen Ashard grew up here, and when Ruth brought her baby home to meet her dad, Grandpa Fred commented, "He's a dinky little thing, isn't he?" And Dinky became the boy's nickname.
Oh, wow.
Growing up here, he was just known as Dinky Dangberg. And it wasn't until the 3rd grade that he learned his real name when his teacher called out Charles Stephen Ashard Jr. in the roll. But Charles Stephen Ashard Jr. had no idea who Charles Stephen Ashard Jr. was and had to come home and ask his mother, "Isn't my name Dinky?" I'm glad to report that Mr. Ashard is still living. He turns 82 this summer, and there he is. He still uses the nickname Dink. He has one daughter, but she's the last of his and Fred Jr.'s line of the family. He and his co-author are shown right here, and this is the book that they wrote just a couple of years ago talking about the Dangberg saga, and it's
Oh,
full of
that's the one you
photographs.
suggested
Uh-huh.
that weekend.
Yeah, and we do have this available for sale. Now, the first of Fred and Gertrude's children was this little boy right here. His name was Dwight. You saw the photograph in the first bedroom of Gertrude bathing him. He was born in 1899, and you can see here he is wearing this little red sailor suit.
Very cute.
Shortly after that photograph was taken, however, Dwight died of scarlet fever. And of course his parents were grief-stricken, and they asked Uncle George, Fred's brother, if he would pack away the boy's possessions in a trunk so they wouldn't have to cope with that themselves. And when we came here to begin cataloging the artifacts a few years ago, we were told about the trunk, and we found it in the upper corner of the attic. And when I had the honor of untying the ropes that Uncle George had bound it with in 1904, 101 years had passed and no one else had ever opened it, and it was packed with Dwight's clothing and his toys, a birthday card from his father, a genuine Washoe cradle board, his little gloves, his boots, a crayon drawing that he produced.
You got. Wasn't that something?
Now this photograph here shows Dwight wearing an outfit that we have that was found in the trunk. These are Levi's overalls with a cotton shirt, and normally we have that displayed right here. But we have lent it to the State Museum for the next few months for their sesquicentennial exhibit for Nevada's statehood anniversary. But we have a comparable pair right here. Again, these are Levi's. They're from the early 1890s, and the Levi's company tells us that as far as they know, these are the oldest Levi's existing in Nevada today, which is why we've lent them to the State Museum. And that's important because Levi's were first created in Reno. Now, Fred and Gertrude did have 4 daughters after Dwight, and I don't have that photo in here, but that doesn't matter. When Margaret and Ruth, the 2 oldest of his daughters, we met Ruth right there, when they were in their later years, they gave an oral history interview to a researcher, and the researcher asked them a logical question. When you were growing up on the ranch, what were your chores? Chores? We didn't have chores. We were expected to play all the time. Their family is well off. They don't need to worry about working, at least that's the idea. They're expected to get a good education, meet a wealthy young man who will sweep them off their feet and keep them in the style to which they've grown accustomed, so to speak. But only one of those 4 daughters achieved that dream. Now, I told you about Ruth, and here's her older sister, the second child, Margaret, named after her grandmother. Now, she didn't go by Maggie, she went by Margaret or Marg. And this photograph shows her in her teenage years. She's wearing her uniform for Miss Ransom and Miss Bridges' private school for girls over in the Bay Area. The three of the daughters attended that school for their last couple of years of high school, a type of finishing school. And then after they graduate, Margaret, she doesn't need to go get a job. She wants to work in the company office to type a little bit. She can, but she doesn't need to. If she needs any money, she probably just holds out her hand and Dad gives her what she needs. If I'd said Mom, would that have worked better?
He's waiting for a hand, I think.
What do you mean?
I'm teasing. I'm having fun. It works better with the gentlemen, but they just look at me and like, I'm not going to give you any money.
Oh.
The ladies my tour guide ladies, they might have better luck with that. Anyway, that's up to them. I probably don't do that. But in 1932, when Margaret was 31 years old, she fell in love and she came home with her boyfriend. His name was Jim McDonald, and they announced to her family, hey, we're going to get married tomorrow. This announcement caused an uproar. We know from the family letters that Margaret and her boyfriend Jim fought terribly with the rest of the family over this marriage. We have a letter from Ruth written about the episode, and she asked Margaret a question. Are you ready to be poor your whole life? That's what they were fighting about. Margaret's fiancé Jim, he was a cowboy. He was a foreman at the company's sheep ranch. He was one of Dad's employees and not good enough for any of his daughters. But they were in love, and they did get married the next day. Good for them. And then Jim McDonald, her husband, began working for the Department of Highways. And in 1935, when they were living in Fallon, Margaret had her only child, Michael David. Michael David died of pneumonia as an infant. And after the baby's death, the marriage disintegrated, the couple divorced, and Margaret returned home here, and she lived here unmarried with her sister Ruth until she died in 1988. We found a time capsule for little Michael David, much like Dwight's trunk. When we finally got the little dresser out of the cardboard box we found it in, we discovered it was full of Michael David's diapers and baby bottles and toys, including a Mickey Mouse toy from the 1930s, probably one of the first produced.
Oh, I guess so.
Michael David chewed away the ears, though. They were probably leather. Now, and I did want to mention that this is one of our favorite. We talked about Gertrude and Dwight in the other room about how wonderful the photos they are. How wonderful the photos of them are. Boy, I'm sure tongue-tied today. The next daughter, this cutie Fritzy. This photo shows Fritzy in 1940. She's on her way back from Hawaii. Yes, when Hawaii was first opened up as a tourist destination. Of course, she didn't get on a plane. She got on a boat. Fritzy was the only daughter to graduate from college. She graduated with an arts and letters degree from Berkeley. And this is 1929, and she's 21 years old, and she gets to go on the grand tour of Europe. And this steamer trunk right here is what she took on the trip. Quite the fancy contraption. I would steal it and take it home for my own use, but then I realized that's never going to fit in the overhead compartment, is it? But we have the closet over here, we have the dresser on this side, and we have all of Fritzy's souvenirs from her trip, her postcards from the Louvre, her little expense notebook, and her passport. And there's Fritzy, 21 years old in 1929. Fritzy's first stop on the trip was New York City. That's where she got on the boat. The first letter home is from the first stop, and the first letter home is written to Dad. And what does Fritzy ask for in the first paragraph?
Money.
Yes. Daddy, please send $1,500. Everything will cost much more than we had planned. It's like your child asking you for $18,000 today. But she did promise to buy him some silk pajamas when she got to England.
Oh, how generous.
Fritzy made her home in San Francisco after that. She didn't want to be under Dad's control, is what Dinky tells me. We have a letter from her sister Margaret in 1939 that illustrates that Fritzy continued to have no problem taking Dad's money. And the letter reads, Daddy says to send you this check, and he wonders why you don't write him more often. If you want to keep your paymaster happy, you should send him a letter every now and then. Now, Fritzy had many a man in love with her, of course, many a suitor. Dad's well off, she's cute, she's fun, what's not to like? And the man that was very much in love with Fritzie was a journalist from Chicago named George Weller. And he's not just any pencil pusher. Mr. Weller won the Pulitzer Prize in 1943. And we know from the letters that he proposed marriage to Fritzie, and we also know from the letters that she turned him down. And we're not sure why, but based on the facts of the family's history, we conclude that it was because she learned of her diagnosis of cancer, which took her life at the age of 38 in 1946. And the youngest sister was Katrina. I like to call her our favorite little troublemaker. She had quite the sense of humor, and her nickname was Scatter, which works with Katrina. And Katrina didn't get to go to Miss Ransom's fancy boarding school because by the time she got old enough, her dad's cash flow is
It changed.
having some problems, much like this picture right there. In the 1920s, there's an agricultural slump. Prices are going down, and Dad's resources are stretched. So no money for fancy private boarding schools, and she went to Douglas County High. Now, she married in 1942 to an attorney from the Midwest, and then she went off to San Francisco to build a home there with him, and I'm going to tell you the rest of her story later on in the tour. Now, do you have any questions in here?
I don't think so.
We do have just a sample of our very large clothing collection on display.
They always had elaborate.
The dresser set, yeah, that was Margaret's, the oldest daughter. And we do have a full clothing exhibit every year. This year it's at the end of September, where we get all of our treasures like Gertrude's wedding gown from 1898. Any other questions?
It's good looking luggage, that's for sure.
This luggage down here?
Well, all these pieces are always
Yeah, I coordinated those were Ruth's. They have her monogram on them.
very efficient. I like the dresses too, they're very bright.
Well, the red and the pink, those are pajamas.
Oh, I wasn't even close, I thought that was like a modern dress.
Well, they were all thin.
They were all 5'2", fairly petite. Yeah, we have a problem sometimes with with Fritzie's dresses especially, is the display mannequins we have are made to fit today's woman, which isn't necessarily as petite. And so we can't get her dresses onto some of these forms. We have to use a child's form and pad it so that she has a bust and some hips. Which is frustrating because some of the gowns she has that she had are quite beautiful, and it's difficult for us to display them appropriate and take care of them at the same time. This room represents the original cabin that H.F. Dangberg built in 1857. The family recognizes it as the cabin, and perhaps part of the cabin is still here. We haven't been able to explore to determine that for sure, but we recognize it in the same way. Fred and Gertrude, as you said, they turned it into a library in the sitting room, built in these shelves, and we have books from 1853, the oldest one is down there on its side, all the way to the 1980s down over here. Mostly 19th century books over there, 20th century books here arranged from the oldest to the newer ones here. And you can see the four daughters' lives reflected in those books, with children's books at the top and adult novels as you get further and further down. And then they get on in their later lives and they get very interested in politics. And Katrina, very interested in animals and safaris and jungles. Now come on over here, because I want to show you this desk. This desk was rescued by Margaret and Ruth from the slaughterhouse to the north of the main house in 1978 when the ranch was sold. And they had it refinished, so that's when the felt date's from. And if we examine the drawers of the desk, we find that this drawer is a little smaller than all of the other drawers. Why?
Hide something behind it.
There's a secret compartment right back there. You can't get to it now because this has been sealed shut, but you used to be able to pull this out to get back there. I like to say that Dad thought it was a secret. Mom knew all about it. Though I don't know if that's true of the Dangbergs. We like to think that Uncle George made this desk because he wrote his name right here in 1908 when he was 33 years old.
Well, bloody
So
good.
That's just our hunch. A gentleman on a tour suggested that this desk might be even older than that, but we haven't had an expert come look at it yet to give us something definitive. Well, let me tell you what happened to Fred. Uncle George, he died in 1936. Fred's brother. He died in 1936, and we're told that George was the peacemaker in that generation. He's got an older brother, Fred, who is a risk taker, another brother, John, who's much more conservative in his business approach, and so there's George in the middle. Hey, can't we all get along and move forward together? But then George dies, and it's the Depression. The company is struggling, they have a heavy debt load, and everyone has a different idea of how to solve the problem and continue to move the company forward and keep it solvent. They were arguing, and they were usually arguing over Fred and his ideas. Now, Fred, as we established earlier, he liked to spend money to live the good life, and he would take business trips to San Francisco, where he would rent a suite of rooms at the Palace Hotel, nothing but the finest, and the other side of the family probably said something like, what part of the Great Depression in our company's financial situation don't you understand? Can't you be more frugal with our dime? Fred might have argued on the other side of that, well, if you want the San Francisco bankers to even give you the time of day, they've got to see that you're a man of means who can be trusted to pay them back. So, valid arguments on both sides of that. And there are valid arguments on both sides of the other issues they were struggling with. How to manage their land, whether to raise sheep or cattle, whether to sell or buy sheep or cattle, whether to improve their equipment, to buy new tractors. And that might have been why Fred's over in San Francisco asking for a loan. We want to remain competitive and stay efficient. But there was only one side to the story of Fred's gambling. By 1941, everyone knew that Fred was writing checks using the company's checkbook to pay off his private gambling debts. And of course, the rest of the family, they're going to take action to protect their interest. It's their livelihood. And there were a variety of shenanigans in this era over the direction of the company. George's shares fell in the hands of a man, the company's attorney, who was allied with John on the other side of the family. And so now the balance of power has shifted away from Fred's control. We have John and his daughter Grace and the attorney all over here, and Fred by his lonesome over here. In the middle is Eva, their sister. She's still a shareholder, even though she's not active in day-to-day management, and she gets a say at the shareholders meeting. And she decides, for whatever reason, that it's better for her to also ally herself with John, even though she was very close to Gertrude and Fred and the daughters. But again, she had to protect her interest. And by the 1941 shareholders meeting, this had all been finalized, and Fred is left out in the cold. Now, he was given a salary, we're told, of $500 per month, which in the 40s is all that anyone might need. But he had significant personal debt. He's got a family to take care of. He has a daughter with cancer who probably had significant medical bills. And so there's not much left over, and the family living here begins a decline into poverty. Margaret and Ruth, the two girls who never had a chore, have to go get jobs. And they both worked for the Department of Highways until they retired. And then in 1946, it got worse. Fritzie died in April, and then Fred died in May, some say of a broken heart, of his daughter's death. And that left Gertrude and Margaret, Ruth, and young Dinky living here. Now, Gertrude inherited all of her husband's shares in the company. She also inherited all of his debt, which has to be settled in the estate. The shares are sold off, and she's left with next to nothing. She starts selling turkeys to the neighbors so that she can bring in some extra money. And I'm going to tell you the last chapter of the story in the next one. Now, Katrina, remember we didn't finish her story? Now, Katrina and her first husband, they divorced in 1949. She did not have any kids from that marriage. And when she divorced, her father has passed away, and she can't turn to him for resources, and so she has to go get a job like her sisters. And the colorful way of putting her situation there is that she figured, well, if I'm going to have to go get a job, I'm going to go get a job where I can find a rich husband. And she gets hired on as postmistress at the Dangberg post office up at Lake Tahoe. Now, if you're gonna own lakeshore land up at Tahoe, you're gonna have the means to buy it. And so I like to say that if you wanted to catch a big fish, the Glenbrook Post Office was a great pond in which to throw out your bait. Katrina had wonderful bait, and she brought in a whopper. Thornton Glide Jr., not only a cowboy, but a very wealthy cowboy. The Glides were very prominent landowning ranchers in Davis, California. And the couple married in 1955, and they stayed married until their deaths in 1995. But Katrina never had children from either of her marriages. But she was the last president of this house.
1955 they got married?
What?
Well,
Were you married?
I got married in 1955.
Well, she's in her 40s now when she got married the second time. So she was born in 1911. So she's like 44 then.
Oh,
And you were much younger than that,
I
weren't you?
certainly was.
Yes. Yeah, because if she was alive today, she'd be 101. And you're not 101, I can
no,
tell
not
that.
quite. I'm getting there though.
It's all Michael's fault, I'm sure. Now, Dicky grew up and started his own life, graduated from college, got married, had his daughter. But Gertrude died in 1968, leaving Margaret and Ruth living here alone, and Katrina living over in Davis with her rancher husband. In 1978, cousin Grace, childless, she owns about half of the company. By then, the other half is owned by the widow of that attorney I mentioned earlier. She doesn't have any children either. And only a minority share, a very small share, is owned by the sisters here and some of their cousins. So Grace and Mrs. Sanford, between the two of them, they own the company. And they decide it's time to sell. There's no one left to take it over. And they sold all 48,000 acres they owned for $16 million is what I was told. And I was also told that it was about half its value. I'm not an expert in ranch land, of course. Especially in 1978, when I was only 4.
Just a kid.
Joking there. But that sale included this land and these buildings. They had always been owned by the company, not by Fred or Gertrude or any individual. The company owned this land. And so a life estate was created for the 3 surviving sisters. They could live here until the end of their days, as long as one of them claimed it as their primary residence. So after her sisters died in the 80s, Katrina would come here from her comfortable home in Davis and live in this house for 6 months of every year so that she could claim it's my primary residence and maintain her right to the life estate and continue to watch over the property. And she was very concerned about that because she and her sisters had developed a plan that when they were gone, this property and everything inside the buildings would be given to the government to create an historic park. And that had been stipulated in the 1978 sales agreement. So when Katrina died in 1995, her estate set the wheels in motion to make that dream a reality. And while that was easier said than done, finally in 2007, the park opened for public tours. And on behalf of the Dangberg sisters, thank you for coming today to help them continue their dream. And that concludes our story, but I have a few more rooms to show you.
All right.
Now this bathroom wasn't always a bathroom. The size helps us understand, and the door right there that goes directly outside helps us understand that this was more than likely the house's first kitchen. With a cook stove instead of that heating stove there. But in the early 20th century it was converted to a bathroom. We found the medicine cabinets packed with toiletries, medicines, makeup from throughout the 20th century. Are you thirsty? I saved you some castor oil. The potty humor in here is over there on the toilet. It's the Margaret Dangberg Memorial Seat, claimed by that little plaque there. Don't blame us, the sisters did that.
Oh.
This wing of the house, the kitchen, and the hands dining room through this door were added on in 1890. We have a large wood-burning stove that was later converted to fuel oil, and we have a Hoosier cabinet in the opposite corner. Next to it we have the classic museum piece, the KitchenAid Harvest Gold dishwasher with the butcher block top. But this piece here that you're looking at, this is called a baking chest, or Dinky called it a bread box, and it has a movable, removable cutting board and a divided storage compartment underneath and a lid. You know, if you're a baker, you want a warm place to have your dough rise, and so they could put that in there or store the supplies at the same time.
That's
Now, after Margaret and Ruth, they divorced and they came home, they packed up all their household goods into boxes, and when they came home, well, they didn't need to unpack their kitchen things, they just put the boxes up in the upstairs of the outbuilding and left them for us to open 70 years later. And we've discovered that apple green was the popular color for trousseaus in the 1930s. So I have a lot of pieces like that. And then when the kids come, I don't know, I guess I'm getting old too. They're like, wow, what's that?
Really?
And we're gonna get some other egg beaters that they can actually, that kind of thing. Because this stuff is our collection and we want to take care of it.
Potato,
The potato ricer,
yep.
yeah, you can still get those today. I know a lot of cooks like those for their mashed potatoes. I just like to pound on. A little bit of lumps. I make good mashed potatoes, I'll tell you that. Now, do you recognize this? Is this a chopper? That's what I thought was in a bowl. You can have a chopper?
I guess it must be, I don't know what else it could be.
I don't know on this one.
Is that our meat grinder we had when I was a kid?
Yeah, meat
Yeah,
grinder, my
we
mom
had
has one of those. We have the attachments for them.
Yeah,
That's where I used to give Shannon her haircuts.
no.
Now, this recliner might, it seems a little out of place, and yeah, it kind of is, but this is exactly where we found this.
Oh,
Gertrude and then Margaret, they suffered from osteoporosis in their later years, so a nice cushy chair in front of the most reliable heat source in the house is a good idea. Friends and family coming through that door for a cup of tea perhaps, or a little something better. And Margaret was a rabid 49ers fan, and she could keep track of the games right up there behind you on that television.
well. That's bad.
Now the kitchen is situated between the fancy family dining room back there and the less fancy dining room for the workers through this door. So we can go on in here.
Oh, the work.
The cowboys, of course, would come in here at crack of dawn, have their meals, get fed as part of their pay. They have a bunkhouse to live in outside. And even though in the later years the family used this as an all-purpose room, we set it back up as we might imagine it may have looked at like more or less when the cowboys came in here for their meals. On this other table, you have some items connected with cowboys, some shafts, some spurs, a boot jack, a spittoon, liquor bottles, and branding irons. This is the Dangberg brand, the reverse FD, for Fred Dangberg. So, of course, it's always fun to tell, well, fun's maybe not the right word, interesting to tell the 3rd and 4th graders all about branding. But the teachers tell us, it's a fact of life here in ranch country, and tell them what branding is. And then around the room, we are setting this up as more of a drop-in museum setting, so if you come here without a tour reservation or you're not interested in the tour, you can come in through that kitchen door and spend some time in here. So we're setting up a variety of exhibits around the room. We have a little cook stove that the girls played with as children there. We have skis and other sporting goods in that corner. We have dishes in the cabinet. We have flashlights and lanterns. We were talking this morning with the 3rd graders about how you lit a room. You have a candle mold, you have a lantern, you have flashlights, and then of course the old phones always confuse some of the kids. What is this? I don't know. But so it's great to show them that comparison, that progression through time, from the wall phone to the desk phone to the cell phone. I did ask one little 8-year-old girl, I said, what is this? And she said, I don't know. And I held up my phone and I said, it's one of these. And she responded, it's a cell phone. And then off to the side here, we have the pantry.
This is a wonderful home.